I'm a 56-year-old woman, and until recently, I'd been living alone in a modest but cozy two-bedroom home that I'd worked hard to keep up. Things were quiet, predictable, and peaceful until my son, his wife, and their two young kids lost their home. They had hit a rough patch financially, and with nowhere else to go, they came to me. At first, I didn't think twice about taking them in. I love my son deeply, and when he told me it would only be for a few months while they saved up to get back on their feet, I thought it would be manageable. After all, family is supposed to help each other in times of need, right? He assured me they'd do everything they could to keep things tidy and cover some expenses, and with his wife's job just starting up again, I trusted they'd be out before long. But as the months went by, it became clear that a few months was stretching far beyond what any of us expected. Within the first 6 months, I started to notice little things. I'd expected them to save, cut back on unnecessary expenses, and work on finding an affordable place. But every time I'd ask, there was always a reason it was still too soon. At the same time, I saw them spending on things that didn't look very frugal: new toys for the kids, takeout dinners, and weekend outings. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe they just needed these small pleasures to get through a tough time. However, small issues became bigger ones. The guest room, once tidy and quiet, became a mess of toys, clothes, and bags. The living area turned into their extended storage space, and my once cozy space now felt crammed. Everywhere I turned, there was a stroller, baby bottle, or toy lying around. I found myself stepping over Legos, sweeping up endless crumbs, and picking up after everyone. I hadn't realized how much I valued my space and quiet until it was gone. And then there was the noise. I'm not against kids being kids, but it was hard to find even a moment of silence. They were full of energy, running up and down the house, knocking things over, and disrupting any quiet I tried to carve out for myself. I'd gone from a quiet home to a chaotic one, and my nerves felt stretched thin. When I hinted that I needed my own space back, my son assured me they were working on it, but there was little action to show for it. The financial strain slowly crept in too. They promised they'd pitch in with groceries and utilities, but more often than not, it was me covering everything. At first I didn't mind, extra food here and there, higher utility bills, nothing too big. But over time, the expenses kept piling up, and I found myself dipping into savings more than I'd planned to keep up with the household demands. When I brought it up, my son would promise to help out next month, or say they were tight on funds. His next month came and went without a change. After nearly a year, I started dropping stronger hints, asking when they might be able to find a place of their own. My son would brush it off, saying they just needed a bit more time. Every conversation ended the same way, and I felt as if my words didn't carry much weight. Then, out of the blue, they shared the news that they were expecting another child. I smiled and congratulated them, but inside, I felt dread wash over me. It was hard enough with 2 kids, and I couldn't imagine how much more crowded things would feel with another. I tried not to let my growing frustration show, but it built up slowly. Each day, I felt more like a guest in my own home. My private sanctuary was no longer mine. The constant noise, clutter, and chaos filled every corner. My son had promised they'd start paying rent to help out, but the payments were inconsistent at best, with him often forgetting until I reminded him. And even then, it wasn't much. The wear and tear on my house was becoming more obvious, too. Furniture that had lasted me years now showed new scuff marks and stains. My kitchen appliances took a beating from constant use, and the bathroom needed repairs from the added strain. Every time I tried to nudge them toward looking for a place, it felt like they had a new reason why it couldn't happen yet. My son would reassure me that he just needed a little more time, a bit more money saved, or for something else to fall into place. He never seemed to take it seriously when I'd try to set boundaries or bring up the toll this was taking on me. Part of me resented the situation, but I held back, afraid of stirring up any family conflict. I didn't want to cause tension or push my son's family away, especially when I knew they were struggling. But with each day, I felt more and more trapped, unsure of how to ask them to leave without creating a rift. All I wanted was my space back, a place to unwind and be myself, without the constant demands, noise, and financial burden. The stress kept building, and I knew things couldn't go on like this forever. I just didn't know how to make that clear without losing my family in the process. Update 1. After nearly a year of this arrangement, I knew something had to change. I couldn't go on like this indefinitely, so I decided it was time for a serious talk with my son and his wife. One evening, after the kids were settled down, I invited them to sit with me in the kitchen. I calmly suggested that they start thinking about finding a new place and reminded them of the original plan. This was meant to be temporary. I tried to be gentle, knowing how hard things had been for them, but I also needed to make it clear that it was time to take some steps forward. My son nodded along, but his response was full of excuses. He explained that with rising costs, they hadn't managed to save up as much as they'd hoped, and finding something affordable would still take time. His wife chimed in, mentioning how difficult it was to manage everything with 2 young kids and her limited work hours. I listened, understanding their points but wondering how long these excuses could stretch. They promised, again, that they'd start saving more seriously and would be out as soon as possible. After our talk, I noticed my son trying to make small adjustments around the house. He offered to help with some of the chores, loading the dishwasher, tidying up the kids' toys, even taking out the trash. It felt like a start, but these were minor tasks and hardly scratched the surface of the larger issue. A few days later, I was hopeful they'd actually start saving, but it wasn't long before I noticed they were still spending on little luxuries. A new video game here, takeout there, small splurges that didn't quite match the tight budget they described. Then their 3rd baby arrived. It was a bittersweet moment for me. I was happy to welcome another grandchild, but at the same time, I knew this only added to the strain. The house was louder than ever, with a newborn crying at odd hours, 2 other kids who seemed to find new energy with a baby around, and my son and his wife trying to juggle everything without much progress on their plans to move. The stress started affecting me physically. I was constantly exhausted, always on edge, and unable to find a moment of peace. Even my health took a hit, headaches became more frequent, and I felt drained all the time. One afternoon, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find one of the kids in my office, a place I had made clear was off limits. They had pulled papers off my desk and were playing with a small collection of personal mementos I kept there. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I held back from snapping. I gently ushered them out, trying not to make a scene, but inside, I felt like a boundary had been crossed. Things only escalated from there. One day, I found one of my antique vases cracked, something I'd held onto for decades. Another time, my vacuum cleaner was left clogged after they used it to pick up a mess in the kids' room. I noticed other small damages around the house, a scratched table, a broken picture frame. These things added up, and while they might seem minor individually, they felt like small symbols of how out of control everything had become in my own home. I tried to talk to my son again about contributing more financially. He started giving me a small amount each month toward rent, but it was inconsistent. Sometimes it would be late, other times it would be less than agreed upon, and when I'd remind him, he'd tell me he'd forgotten or had an unexpected expense that month. I could feel my savings dwindling, stretched thin by extra groceries, utilities, and now even repairs. Eventually, I decided enough was enough. I set a firm 6-month deadline for them to find their own place. I hoped that putting a clear timeline in place would give them the push they needed to finally move out. But my son didn't take it seriously. When I brought it up, he just laughed it off, saying they'd figure it out and that he wasn't worried. To him, it was just another casual remark, but I was growing more resentful by the day. Around this time, my son's wife mentioned that her own family couldn't take them in either. I hadn't brought this up as an option, but her comment made it clear they had no other escape route, and I was the only option they'd consider. It left me feeling trapped, almost like they expected me to just accept this indefinite arrangement without complaint. As the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd enabled this situation. By providing a safe space, had I unintentionally made it easy for them to avoid responsibility? I'd hoped to be a supportive mother and grandmother, but instead, it seemed like I'd been too accommodating, letting them take over my space, my finances, and my peace of mind. I felt torn, not wanting to push them away but unable to keep living this way. It was becoming painfully clear that my gentle nudges and subtle reminders weren't going to change anything. This was no longer a short-term favor, it was turning into something much larger, with no end in sight. And while I still loved my family, I realized that I needed to make a plan for how to reclaim my life and my home, before it was too late. Update 2. With 6 months ticking away and no real sign of change, I decided to establish some house rules. It seemed like a fair middle ground, something that could allow me to reclaim some personal space and set boundaries without forcing them out immediately. I made a list, quiet hours after 9 p.m., keeping the kids out of certain areas like my office, and a request that they clean up after themselves promptly. I explained it all calmly, hoping this would improve things a little. At first they nodded, but in practice, nothing changed. The kids still burst into my office when I left the door open by mistake, toys and clothes were left scattered everywhere, and the noise after bedtime was impossible to ignore. Even my requests for some quiet during the day went ignored, with my son and his wife barely acknowledging the rules I'd set. They were treating my home as if it were theirs alone, and every time I tried to bring it up, they either brushed it off or made a joke about kids just being kids. Finally, I called a family meeting. I sat them down in the living room and explained that I couldn't keep going like this. I talked about the strain it was putting on me, not just financially but mentally and physically. I made it clear that I was reaching my limit and needed them to start respecting my space and sticking to the rules we had agreed on. My daughter-in-law's reaction caught me off guard. She accused me of being selfish, saying that I was putting money and peace above family. She pointed out that they were going through a rough patch and that it wasn't fair of me to expect everything to be perfect. Her words hit hard, but I knew this wasn't about perfection. It was about my home, my sanctuary becoming unrecognizable and out of control. Word of our disagreement spread to other family members, and soon I found myself caught in the middle of a family divide. Some relatives sided with me, agreeing that I had every right to set boundaries in my own home, especially after helping my son's family for so long. Others, though, thought I was being unreasonable, with a few even implying that as a mother and grandmother, it was my duty to put up with this for the sake of family. It was a difficult position to be in, feeling judged no matter what I did. When I shared my frustrations with a few close friends, they encouraged me to take a firmer stand. They reminded me that this was my space, my life, and I had already sacrificed so much to accommodate my son's family. One friend suggested that I look into affordable housing options for them, thinking maybe they just needed a little nudge in the right direction. Inspired by this, I started researching local resources and even found a few options within their budget. When I showed my son the options I'd found, he took it the wrong way. He assumed I was eager to get rid of them, making me out to be the villain for even suggesting they look elsewhere. He insisted that moving right now wasn't feasible, and that they simply needed more time. I tried to explain that my own financial resources were running low, but he dismissed it, acting as if I was being dramatic or exaggerating the impact. A few days later, things came to a head. We ended up in a heated argument, one where I couldn't hold back anymore. I raised my voice, something I hadn't done in years, telling him about the real toll this situation had taken on me. The constant noise, lack of respect for my things, and the financial strain had all started wearing me down. I wasn't trying to push them away, I just couldn't keep going like this. The stress finally took its toll on me physically. I had a minor health scare, nothing too serious, but enough to wake me up to the fact that I couldn't let this go on indefinitely. My doctor advised me to take it easy, focus on my well-being, and try to reduce stress wherever possible. It felt almost impossible to do that with my current living situation. Desperate for a solution, I reached out to a local community organization that helps families find housing. I thought they could assist my son's family, but when I suggested they consider the support, my son brushed it off as unnecessary. He kept saying they'd work it out on their own, still assuming that my worries were an overreaction. Each day, my desperation grew. I had tried everything: rules, gentle conversations, family meetings, even external help, and nothing seemed to make a difference. They dismissed my boundaries, ignored my financial limits, and seemed to think I was overreacting every time I raised an issue. I had always been there for my son and his family, but it was clear now that my kindness was being taken for granted. Realizing that gentle nudges wouldn't work, I knew I had to prepare for a tougher conversation. Update 3. After trying every gentle approach, I finally decided that I had to set a firm deadline. One evening, I sat down with my son and his wife, and I laid it out clearly they had 3 months to find a new place. This arrangement wasn't sustainable anymore, and they needed to take my deadline seriously. I was firm and straightforward, hoping they'd understand the urgency. Their reaction wasn't what I expected. My son and his wife were shocked, and I could see the hurt in their faces. They accused me of abandoning them, of turning my back on family when they needed me most. They reminded me of times when I'd leaned on family for support, and they tried to make me feel guilty for drawing a line now. My son kept pointing out how difficult the rental market was, how they'd saved up only a little, and how 3 months wasn't enough time. But I didn't budge. I explained that while I understood their difficulties, the situation was affecting my health, my finances, and my peace. I'd tried every way to make it work, but my home had turned into a place where I no longer felt comfortable. They needed to understand that I had limits, and we'd reach them. The conversation shifted to money, with my son arguing they hadn't saved enough to move. I tried to offer suggestions, even going through their spending with him to highlight where they could cut back, but he got defensive, saying I didn't understand how tight things were for them. No matter what solutions I offered, he seemed determined to see this as me forcing them out before they were ready. Seeing that this wasn't going to end with an easy agreement, I started taking other steps. The next day, I contacted a lawyer to understand the eviction laws. I didn't want it to go that far, but I needed to be prepared if they refused to leave. The lawyer explained my options, and while I hoped it wouldn't come to that, knowing the process gave me some peace of mind. Meanwhile, I began setting boundaries with the grandkids, explaining to them which rooms were now off limits. They were too young to fully understand, but I made it as gentle as possible, showing them that some parts of the house were grown-up spaces. Despite their parents' reluctance, the kids seemed to pick up on the new rules, and I appreciated that small bit of control over my own home. In the days following, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. My son and his wife barely spoke to me, creating an uncomfortable silence that lingered in every room. Then, one day, I found out that my daughter-in-law had taken the situation to social media. She posted a long message venting her frustration, painting me as the villain who had turned her own family out. Friends and distant family members reached out, some expressing sympathy, others judging me for what they saw as a heartless decision. Divided opinions started pouring in. Some family members reached out privately, showing their support and saying they understood why I needed my home back. Others hinted that I was being too harsh, suggesting that family should always come first, no matter the cost. I appreciated the ones who understood and offered words of encouragement, but it hurt to see people taking sides and assuming the worst of me. Despite the drama, I held firm. I reminded myself of everything I'd done to support my son's family and all the times I'd tried to make this work. I'd sacrificed enough, and it was time to reclaim my own space. Over the next few weeks, I overheard my son discussing rental options with his wife. Although he still seemed hesitant and uncertain, it gave me a glimmer of hope that they might actually start looking. And just as things seemed to be moving, a surprise offer came in from one of my relatives. They'd heard about the situation and reached out, offering a small donation to help my son's family cover moving expenses if they committed to finding a place. It was a generous gesture, and I let my son know about it, hoping it would encourage him to take action. The silent treatment persisted, with tension filling every interaction. But now, with support from some family and friends, as well as this unexpected financial help, I felt empowered to stick with the deadline. This time, I wasn't going to back down. I'd given them every chance, every kindness I could manage, and now it was time to follow through. My home had become unrecognizable, but I was determined to reclaim it. 3 months was all they had left, and for the first time, I felt confident that I would see this through, no matter what. Update 4. With the final weeks of the 3-month deadline approaching, I began preparing both mentally and physically for my son's family to move out. I started organizing the guest room, packing away some of their things into labeled boxes, and deep cleaning areas of the house that had been neglected. It felt surreal, as though I was making arrangements for a new chapter of my life, even though part of me worried they might still try to push the deadline. My suspicions proved right when, just a week before they were supposed to leave, my son came to me with a new request. He asked if they could stay just a few more months, claiming they needed a bit more time to adjust financially. I listened but stayed firm, reminding him of the 3 months we'd agreed on and all the extensions they'd already had. This time, I wouldn't budge. Undeterred, he handed me an unexpected bill for some utilities and groceries, implying that covering it would help them out. I knew what he was trying to do, using guilt to pressure me into easing up on the deadline. But I stood my ground, letting him know that I couldn't continue covering extra costs, especially with them leaving soon. After our conversation, he left looking annoyed, but I didn't let it affect my resolve. A few days later, he finally shared that they'd found a rental. It was smaller than what they'd hoped for, but it was affordable and available right away. I could sense they weren't thrilled about it, but I reassured him that this was a positive step toward regaining their independence. However, even with the moving plan in place, the tension didn't disappear. Instead, it grew. My daughter-in-law, who was already distant, started openly blaming me for pushing them out and for their need to settle for something less than ideal. I kept my responses brief, knowing that arguing wouldn't solve anything at this point. As moving day approached, I spent time with my grandkids, knowing that they didn't fully understand what was happening. I read to them, played their favorite games, and tried to explain that they'd have a new home soon but could still come visit. Saying goodbye to them was bittersweet. They hugged me tightly, asking why they had to leave, and I had to swallow back my emotions as I reassured them they'd be all right. On the day they were scheduled to leave, my son tried one last guilt trip. He brought up old memories, times when I had relied on family, as if to remind me of all the support I'd received over the years. But I remained calm and told him that while I'd always be here for them, this arrangement wasn't possible anymore. He sighed, gave me a look I couldn't quite read, and walked back to finish packing. My daughter-in-law didn't go quietly, though. She continued to post on social media, painting me as the heartless mother-in-law who'd kicked her family out during tough times. Friends and distant relatives reached out, some siding with me, while others hinted that I was overstepping. I didn't engage. The online world could think what it wanted, but I knew the reality of everything I'd done to support them up to this point. Finally, the house was empty. After over a year of noise, clutter, and tension, the silence felt almost unnatural. For the first time in months, I walked through my home without tripping over toys or being interrupted by chatter. It was eerily quiet, and while I felt an enormous sense of relief, there was also an unexpected wave of loneliness. I missed the sounds of my grandkids laughing and the lively energy they brought, but I reminded myself that this was what I'd wanted: my space, my peace. With them gone, I set about cleaning and repairing the house. I tackled the scuff marks on the walls, fixed the broken picture frames, and deep cleaned the carpets, which had endured more spills than I could count. As I went through each room, I realized the toll the past year had taken on my home. But with each scrub and polish, I felt a sense of healing, like I was reclaiming my sanctuary one corner at a time. As the days passed, I focused on my health and routine, finally able to unwind without interruption. The stress that had weighed on me so heavily lifted little by little, and I felt my energy returning. I started sleeping better, my headaches faded, and I rediscovered simple pleasures I hadn't had time for, like sitting down with a cup of tea and a good book. Despite the relief, the family divide lingered. Some relatives continued to view my actions as harsh, holding a quiet grudge, while others reassured me I'd done the right thing. I found myself reflecting on it all: the long months of tension, the boundaries I'd struggled to set, and the exhaustion that had piled up. I realized I had been right to prioritize my own well-being, even if it hadn't been easy. I loved my family, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself to meet their endless needs. In the end, I knew I'd made the right choice. My home was mine again, and I could finally breathe without feeling overwhelmed. Update 5. With my son and his family officially moved out, I felt an initial wave of relief as the house settled into a peaceful quiet I hadn't experienced in over a year. The silence was a new kind of comfort, and I found myself savoring simple routines without interruption, sitting down with my morning coffee, catching up on reading, and reclaiming every room that had been overtaken. I'd missed this sense of control and solitude, and the peace felt like a long-lost friend returning. Not everything felt completely settled, though. I caught myself thinking about whether I'd made the right choice, especially when I thought of my grandkids. I missed their laughter and hugs, and there were pangs of guilt that would creep in, making me question if I could have handled things differently. But I reminded myself of everything I'd tried, all the months I'd stretched myself, and I knew I couldn't have done much more without losing my sense of self. Then, after about a week of this new routine, my son started visiting regularly, often bringing the kids. The first few visits were wonderful. He'd drop by for a short while, let the kids play in the yard, and it was a pleasant way to reconnect. But soon, these visits started stretching longer and longer. I noticed the kids slipping back into old habits, leaving toys around and wandering through the house as if it were still their home. My son would sometimes use my kitchen supplies or leave things out, little reminders of the months of mess and chaos that had only just started to fade. After a few too many of these extended visits, I had to set a gentle but clear boundary. I let my son know that while they were welcome to visit, this wasn't their home anymore, and there were limits on how long they could stay. He seemed to understand, nodding along, but there were hints of resistance. Every now and then he'd mention how cramped the new place was, subtly suggesting that they could use my house for extra space when needed. I kept my response simple, gently reminding him that their new home was where they needed to settle. Over time, I started reinforcing these boundaries. I set specific visiting hours, letting them know that while I loved seeing them, I needed my own space too. During one visit, my son tried to tug at my heartstrings, pointing out that the kids missed coming home and didn't understand why things had to change. I stayed calm and explained that while I'd always be here for them, their home was now somewhere else. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt necessary to keep things balanced and healthy. In the midst of all this, I started reaching out to the family members who had supported my decision. I focused on repairing connections that had become strained and leaning on friends who had been a solid support throughout this ordeal. Their encouragement helped reinforce my choice, and I found comfort in their understanding. I knew that while my decision hadn't pleased everyone, the people who mattered understood. Occasionally, my son would hint at financial issues, subtly mentioning expenses they hadn't anticipated. Each time, I'd listen and nod but didn't offer help. I'd learned from past mistakes, and while I empathized with their situation, I knew getting involved again would only reopen old wounds. My daughter-in-law, meanwhile, continued her online complaints, portraying me as the parent who turned her back on family in their time of need. I chose not to respond or engage, letting her tell her side however she pleased. My family and friends who truly knew me stood by my decision, and that was enough. With my home and time finally back to myself, I began picking up old hobbies, things I hadn't had the energy or space for in ages. I joined a book club, started going on morning walks, and even signed up for a painting class. The time I'd spent managing household chaos was now filled with small joys that brought me a sense of renewal. My home felt lighter, my spirit felt freer, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fully in control of my life. Sometimes, I'd look back on the months when my house had been filled with the noise and activity of my son's family. I recognized how much I'd sacrificed during that time, but I also saw the strength it had given me to finally assert my boundaries. The experience had been challenging, Yes, but it had shown me the importance of maintaining a space that I could truly call my own. One day, my son and I had a final, heartfelt conversation. I made it clear that while I loved them deeply and would always be there when they needed support, my home was now my own space to enjoy alone. I reminded him that he and his family had their own home to build memories in, and this was a chance for them to grow independently. He listened, reluctantly but respectfully, seeming to understand that these boundaries weren't about pushing them away, but about creating a healthier relationship moving forward. In the end, I knew that standing my ground was the right thing to do. The bond with my son remained, and I was hopeful that with time, our relationship would strengthen in a way that respected both our needs. My home was mine again, and I could finally look forward to each day with peace, purpose, and the freedom to live life on my terms.